Just as I was beginning seminary, my congregation moved into a new building. I was on the board at the time, and I was one of those general busybodies with my nose in everything. And so I was involved somehow in renovating the space to make it suitable for Unitarian Universalists. First and foremost, that meant removing the giant cross from the front of the room. Now, if you're new, I need to clarify, UUs don't have a problem with crosses. We're not vampires. There are lots of people who are both UU and Christian, but there's lots who aren't too. And so just lifting up one perspective like that would have been a bit more Jesus than my congregation was looking for on a weekly basis. So the theology of it was clear, but in practical terms, it turns out that wood is quite heavy. That phrase, cross to bear, it's not just a pretty metaphor. Even getting this thing off the wall was a feat of engineering and a near-death experience, and now what? A giant cross wouldn't exactly fit in the back of my minivan. It would probably need to be cut into pieces, but you can't use the power saw in the building because sawdust flies everywhere, and the building committee had already told me no more power saws in the sanctuary. So this was the line of thinking that led me to a conversation with my friend Anne, who is a woman of great maturity and perspective. This is a sensitive time for your neighbors, Anne explained. With the loss of the old church that shrank down until they couldn't afford their building, your new neighbors will be grieving. But there's also potential for new connection, for inviting people in. And Liz, the community's introduction to Unitarian Universalism cannot be you taking a power saw to a cross on the front lawn, no matter how convenient you might think that is. I'm not sure actually how the cross was removed in the end. For some reason, they didn't involve me any further, but it got done. But here's the thing. The cross had hung there for many years, beside the huge vaulted window through which light streamed down. And it's true what they say. Light really does transform everything it touches, particularly on a timescale of years. And so, sure enough, the paint around the cross had grown distinctly lighter, but the paint behind the cross had not so much. So now, immediately beside the pulpit, there was a clear stenciled outline, which we could have solved by repainting, of course. But in order to do that, we would have had to agree on paint colors. And the decorating committee pointed out that colors couldn't be chosen until the fabric for the new chairs, which would replace the pews, had been chosen. And the worship committee felt that the pews couldn't be removed until we talked about how we embody our identity in the structure of our worship space, particularly when it comes to religious authority, which of course involved the board. And so, for many months, we did not worship beside a giant cross. Instead, we worshipped beside a very conspicuous shadow that was cast by its absence. It was like a giant metaphorical Jesus was here symbol stenciled above our heads. In more ways than one, actually. It was on the literal wall, of course, but it was also in the conspicuous role that the Protestant tradition we come from plays in everything we do. It's in the tunes of the songs we sing. It's in piano accompaniment, the format of a sermon. It's often in the bones of our building. It's in the fact that we meet on a Sunday morning. We've expanded our theology to welcome people in, but we embody it in ways that are very similar to those that we've used for centuries. So to me, the shadow of the cross on the wall on Sunday morning was a physical manifestation of a structure that was frozen in time. It said, we've decided to do things differently, but we're not quite doing that yet, because the details are still stuck in committee. So around this time of the shadow of the cross business, I was also feeling somewhat stuck in committee myself. I was deeply in love with Unitarian Universalism and its values, and I was expressing that love by going to seminary, where we talked about this shadow of the cross stuff. We wouldn't have used that language, but we talked about the rapid pace of change in society and how might we be able to meet it. We talked about modern needs and how we might expand our structures, but we had all of those conversations in a university, mirroring the old ways of doing things with every detail of our current structure, with all of the expense that goes with academia and the inertia and the gatekeeping. And by approaching the issue only from that perspective, we were taking down the cross, but continuing to function within the confines of its shape. So I sucked at all of it. So even when I'm not critiquing the premise of school, which I often am, I'm a terrible student. Forcing my brain to study has always felt like trying to wrestle an active toddler into a car seat. I had long since received an ADHD diagnosis, which is the medical term for the active toddler car seat situation. I had some medication, I had behavioral suggestions, I of course had all the messages that go with that. At the time, I saw myself as disordered and the wrong shape for academia. But I loved Unitarian Universalism, and I wanted to serve it, and this was how you did it. So I was determined to squeeze into the shape that was asked of me. Like, sometimes I was determined. On my better behaved days, I was determined. On my less disciplined days, I would skip the books and sermons we were supposed to be paying attention to, and I would do what I loved to do, which is laugh. And I remember one day procrastinating on my homework, watching these stand-up comedians on YouTube, and thinking, wait a second. They're talking about the exact same ideas as the people in the books I'm supposed to be reading. Big topics, often, and tricky ones. Stand-up comedians will tackle it all. Religion, race, money, ethics, everything. But they do it in a way that's funny and accessible and easy to pay attention to. And that was the beginning of a doorway in me. Maybe the fact that I had so much trouble paying attention to academia wasn't a flaw that would make me a crappy minister, although I would have been a crappy minister, but maybe it was a superpower that would allow me to do something different. Maybe I could make a form of UUism that was easier to pay attention to, a way that would make space at the welcome table for people like me. The farther I moved from the powerless position of a grade school child, the more assertive this line of thinking became. I would sit in my school lecture and the usual messages would run through my mind. The problem is that I need to be better at paying attention. But now there was this voice that argued back, that argued, how come it's always that I have to work harder to pay attention? I've been working as hard as I can to pay attention for years. How come that guy doesn't have to work any harder at being easy to pay attention to, huh? Amen. Thank you. So when it wasn't dry, the stuff I was learning was also, it wasn't what I expected. I already had a sense of our history in my head that was pretty inaccurate. I had stories like Michael Servetus, the Unitarian martyr, chased and persecuted, ultimately burned at the stake for his brave act of speaking the truth to John Calvin. It turns out, if you read Servetus's writings in his own words, he's smart and he's very articulate. He's also quite obnoxious. Like, he doesn't just tell his truth, he stalks John Calvin. He writes him letters, arguing every little point. He distributes books. He was like the worst type of internet troll, but in real life. At one point, Calvin has a warrant out for Servetus's arrest, and Servetus goes to one of Calvin's talks and sits in the front row. Servetus did not deserve what happened to him. Nobody deserves that. But after reading his actual words dripping with arrogance and condescension, there was like this little part of me that sympathized with John Calvin's perspective. Like, I know that guy, right? I have chaired meetings containing that guy. Sometimes I have been that guy in the meeting. He is the best of us in some ways, and he is the worst of us in others. Or Emerson and Thoreau, that's another one. I had always admired the transcendentalists, how they forged these intentional, beautiful lives full of integrity. Learning a bit more about it now, Thoreau could retreat to the woods to suck the marrow out of life because he was living on land that Emerson was letting him use for free. Where'd the land come from, Thoreau? And the story about how you're making the bold choice to live a simple life in the woods? I think we can fairly say Thoreau didn't invent the idea of living simply in those woods. In fact, before Thoreau's people arrived, simply was the only way anybody was ever living in those woods. There was this whole system that supported Thoreau. He had no kids to take care of. He had his free land. We're pretty sure Emerson's wife was doing his laundry. Louisa May Alcott, meanwhile, is living a few miles away, making all the same theological points about simplicity and intentionality and virtue in what became her best-selling novel, Little Women. But she wrote them in a way that wasn't academic. She was funny. While her dad sat in the study talking philosophy with Thoreau and Emerson, he did not work for much of Louisa's life, Louisa got to work writing. In a world not built for women to have a voice, she found a way to have one. In a world not built for women to earn, she found a way to feed her family with that voice, and she did all of that while doing her own laundry. So I'm sure you can hear my frustration here. I was not the only person who felt this way. We malcontents found one another and we bonded, and then we used our pent-up irritation and our specific knowledge to play witty and very historically specific pranks on each other. One time, some of our friends who ran the UU Housing Cooperative in Boston posted online that they were accepting applications for new roommates. A few of us applied as mostly dead, mostly Unitarians and Universalists. We applied as Emerson, listing Thoreau under pets. We applied as Michael Servetus, and under food allergies, we wrote barbecue. I'm not endorsing it, I'm just saying what happened. We applied as the people we thought were missing from our mainstream history, too. Reverend Olympia Brown, the first woman in the US to be ordained. Dorothy Dix, whose tireless lobbying transformed conditions for institutionalized people in the United States, Canada, and a couple of other countries. These women's names are not our best-known heroes, but when you line their lives up against Thoreau in the woods or Servetus with his letters, you can't deny their stories deserve just as much acknowledgement. The housing co-op wrote back and invited us for an interview, which is awkward, although they did caution us that some housemates may not have experience in living with the dead and may require education on matters of corporeal privilege. All of this was followed by a week of messaging and coordinating and giggling and pranking that left me feeling warm and connected. Connected with my peers and with my UU heritage. We were poking fun at things we thought should be knocked down a peg or two, lifting up stories that aren't always told. And the prank connected with me with my values, too. We were always coordinating to know just how far to push things. We wanted to keep it funny for everybody, including the targets of the joke. Above all, that prank left me feeling a part of Unitarian Universalism. We understood the shared jokes because they came out of our shared stories. I mean, corporeal privilege? How UU is that? This was a space that had room for me, where I didn't have to change shape to fit into a prescribed shadow. And I didn't want it to end. And so on a whim, I created a Facebook group and I named it the UU Hysterical Society. It was a play on the UU Historical Society, who have changed their name like twice since then, so nobody ever gets my joke. People usually just point out that the word hysterical has a troublesome history. It's been used as a weapon to discredit and often harm women. People are right. Throughout history, the symptoms of hysteria have been very varied. Sometimes it was a woman who was struggling with what we would now call a mental illness or a disability. Sometimes it was a physical condition like epilepsy or a life choice like deciding not to get married. Often it was a woman who was unwilling or unable to toe the line in some way. Sometimes it was a firebrand warrior pioneer of strength, too. Hysteria was just this catch-all word for any woman who was being inconvenient, who needed to be treated. A hysterical woman is a woman who's the wrong shape. And I, who was struggling so hard to fit into the shadow of the cross, I loved the UU Hysterical Society because I was the wrong shape. And this was an expression of my values. It was a space that fit me. It was a break from the ministerial formation process at a time when that process was starting to break me. And for years, I didn't think of it as anything more than my own personal refuge. By the time I figured out what was going on, we had about 20,000 members. Someone posted that she nearly drove her car off the road after spotting a UU church. She said she thought we were a joke religion made up for the purposes of the UU Hysterical Society, and that seeing a real UU church was like spotting a unicorn. She said she almost drove her car off the road yelling, "They're real! They're real!" And I thought, wow, we could be telling 20,000 people about what UUism is. And then I thought a word you can't say on Sunday morning, because I'm not the right person to represent UUism to 20,000 people. I didn't finish the assigned reading. Fortunately, I didn't have to be the right person for the job. A religious educator named Kathy joined the team at about that time and was able to fill in some of those gaps. Together, we stewarded the group as it continued to grow, and I toyed with the idea that maybe we should become something more. Specifically, maybe we should become a legal entity that could apply for a grant to fund the work that Kathy was putting in. But even thinking along those lines felt presumptive. Like, who did I think we were? Like, not rhetorically, literally, I didn't know who we were or what we were doing. And then, in November of 2019, something happened that changed my perspective forever. My friend, Reverend Mbutsa Ndajimana, approached me for help raising money to settle a group of refugees. And so in November of 2019, the Hysterical Society held its first charity fundraiser. It was holiday-themed because Christmas, refugees, that makes sense. We sold funny PDFs, like labels for wine that said, "Hey, this was water a minute ago." And tags that said, "It's the thought that counts, and I way overthought this." We sold flasks that said, "For when thoughts and prayers are not enough." And another one that said, "This is my spiritual practice," which is a pun in two ways. And we raised more than $16,000. And on one of my trips to the post office with my flasks, the post office guy said, "Okay, I'll bite. What is a UU Hysterical Society?" He said that on the return address. And I didn't respond in the way I usually do when asked what I do for a living. Normally, I mumble, "I run a Facebook group that makes fun of my religion," which is not an accurate answer, but it does end the conversation. Instead, I lifted my head up and I grinned, and I answered with confidence and said that we were a group that is about joy and community and refugees. We had started gathering around laughter, which is a good in and of itself. It's like a soup kitchen for the soul, right? But we were slowly turning into more than that. We were still about laughter and community, but also about bringing dignity to people who deserved a chance to build a new life. The Canadian not-for-profit Mirth and Dignity was incorporated the following month. And to this day, 100% of our merchandise sales, available today at the back, goes to the charity that Mbutsa founded. Most of what we do, though, is support forms of UUism that are not supported by our traditional institutions. We started with the UU Hysterical Society, then we added a board game ministry, and there's this project on TikTok, and then a comedy podcast, and most recently, online soulful singing. I could go on. This is not an infomercial. You don't need this much detail, unless you share our vision of UUism beyond traditional structures, in which case you might want to become one of the people who supports us with a $5 a month pledge, like your President Chris has been so generously doing for years. Okay, now I am done. For now, what I actually want to draw your attention to is the overarching arc of this story, that feeling of not quite fitting, which is, I find, a feeling that a lot of UUs can empathize with. Many of us became UU because we didn't fit into the communities that we were born into. We've figured out how to be diverse theologically, and I believe we're also right now in the process of creating structural diversity, a bunch of different ways to be UU. We have together inherited a shadow of a cross, a set of institutions and practices that define real religion that don't fully work for modern communities. I've heard from people who feel like they're tired trying to do too much and feel focused on the wrong things. In our churches and in larger society, we are working ourselves into a kind of exhaustion, and even that isn't doing the trick. Maybe we don't need to work harder. Maybe we've already been working as hard as we can for years. Maybe something is changing. Maybe this pressure doesn't mean what we think it does. What if we're not cracking because we're breaking, but because we're turning into something different? Changing our shape or our approach, what if we lean in to building something new? I have no idea where that will lead, any more than I had any idea where the prank in 2015 would lead. But I do know that the first step is to give ourselves permission to be who we are, not who we think we're supposed to be being. What would we do differently if we saw ourselves as hatching? What if it were an adventure? As the Leonard Cohen lyric tells us so beautifully, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There are cracks in everything. That's how the light gets in. Which is true, I think, but it's also not the whole picture. The cracks are how the light gets in, yeah, but sometimes the cracks are also how the light gets out. The cracks are where the hatching starts.